Today on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation with Jon Raymond, editor at Plazm magazine, as well as the author of a new short story collection called Livability and the co-screenwriter of the films Old Joy and Wendy and Lucy. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Jon Raymond is an editor at Plazm magazine and the author of the novel The Half-Life, as well as the new short story collection Livability, two of whose pieces have been adapted with filmmaker Kelly Reichardt into the feature films Old Joy and Wendy and Lucy. Jon, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks so much.
Knowing that you're a Portland guy and that you're a booster, we might say, of the city, It is a great city. You've got to have a complicated relationship with the word livability, is that right?
It's very true, yeah. It's funny, I am a real jingoist for Portland, but the concept of livability has obviously been kind of hovering over this town for decades at this point, and I find it like a kind of hilarious idea. It just always sounds so kind of thin to me in a certain sense, like, is livability really the goal here? Like, is that the best we can possibly hope for? It always kind of rings to me like just merely surviving, and like I understand its whole, meaning, basically you're close to the mountains or something, but yeah, it just always, at some point it just sort of started looking very, very meager.
What to a real Portland resident, what is this like, seeing your city pop up so much on these magazine lists of the best places to live in America, but at the same time, people aren't generally flocking to it? I mean, the people who live there like it, but I don't talk to a lot of people who dream of going to Portland.
No, well, I mean, it's funny. It's like, there's only so much a person can really do here. I mean, one of the interesting things about Portland is that there kind of is no economy here, so there's no jobs, and so it kind of ends up being more of a retirement villa for people more than anything else. But it's funny to see that it is interesting to see it showing up on these kind of lists, and to see the New York Times romancing it. It seems like every week practically. I mean, as someone who grew up here, I always felt like this was just an incredibly remote, out of it kind of place. Like, it always seemed to me the story of Portland was the kind of place people get stuck in and don't get to leave, or it's kind of the last place to know about certain things, or it's kind of a place where people's dreams sort of vanish. I can't deny the fact that in the last 5 to 10 years, something has happened, and Portland has kind of broken whatever spell of torpor it seemed to have been living under for, at least the previous 150 years. And yeah, I mean, it seems like we are, in a small way, like, knitted into modernity at this point. But I, as someone who's been here for a while, it looks like a very recent development.
Do you mean the change was then entirely in Portland, or has there been as well a change in your stance toward Portland, whatever it may be?
Oh, no, I think it's actually a change in the place. I think that I am, as a person living here, as a citizen of the town, I am sort of involved in it, whether I like to be or not. But I think it's something that's kind of happening of its own accord. There's just sort of some sort of decision got made,
How much, in terms of the stories in this book, Livability, how much was it the fact that you were writing about characters in the place you live versus how much you wanted to write Portland and the surrounding area-based stories, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think they sort of lean on each other in a certain way. I mean, I'm interested in writing in a kind of regionalist mode. The novel that I published also was Portland-based, and I felt like concerned with kind of characters and histories that are unique to this place. I guess at some point I kind of have rejected the more globalist idea that everywhere is exactly the same, and that we're living in a flat world, and I'm kind of curious to kind of to pinpoint people and stories that are more unique to a particular geography. And so, to me, the people in the geography are kind of both facets of the same thing, and they're both sort of the subject I'm trying to work through here.
What sorts of qualities do you find particularly literarily rich about Portland? And I mean, maybe the Northwest is a better way to put it.
Yeah, I don't think I find anything particularly literarily rich. I hope that it doesn't hit me in those sort of elevated terms. But I do find things, I don't know. I guess it's, I think it's probably the same things that would hit someone in any kind of place. It just so happens that this is where I grew up, and this is kind of the cards I was dealt. These are the people I know and the places I've watched change over the years. But, a lot of it has to do with the kind of peripheral place's relationship to a kind of national narratives. A lot of it just has to do with normal human disappointment and joy and also, I think, peculiar forms of masculinity and femininity and family. I think it's the basic sort of literary themes, I guess. Ultimately, it's just I hope that they can kind of wear the clothes of this place.
You mentioned masculinity, and it rings a bell as something I've read you say or write about in interviews before, that Portland and the Northwest have their own kind of masculinity that has also not become feminized, but kind of a domesticated masculinity. I can't imagine that I'm getting at what you mean, but what is that area's distinct masculinity?
Well, I think this is something that was particularly kind of getting worked through in Old Joy, both the story and the film. And to me, there is a sort of post-feminist model of men here that is that probably is similar down in California too, but it is a sort of, it's not exactly a feminized thing, but it is a softer, more pliant, and more openly kind of sensitive and tender kind of man model. I just with that story in particular, I was kind of interested in pushing the sensitive man to the point where he does actually become passive-aggressively competitive in some kind of way. I guess passive aggression also is the kind of overarching mode of this particular character type I'm talking about. I think it's different than certain Western, like Western as in like the American West, Western ideas of the rugged individual man. It's actually, if anything, a rejection of that, and at this point, it's kind of been going on long enough, and it has sort of trickled down through enough generations that I think it has its own whole kind of worldview and set of postures and attitudes, if that makes any sense. It's also very abstract. I'm sorry.
Well, that's fine. When I was reading the story, Old Joy, and also watching the film, I think maybe in the film this is a little more direct. The main character, the less slacker of the two, I guess you might call it. I don't know how much slacker is a term. He first appears as what seemed to me before I learned more about him to be kind of a caricature. I don't know if you ever saw that site Stuff White People Like.
I have, yeah. I think it's really hilarious.
He seemed to be. Was there any element of satire?
I think he could fit into that kind of demographic. Surely, and I think more so in the film. Actually, I think he's a little bit more distinctly middle class in the film. In the story, I think there's maybe a little bit more. I think he's maybe less definable, but yeah, I do find that to be a really funny sight. Actually, that guy came and visited Portland not too long ago, and talk about it? He talks about Portland as kind of like this weird ultimate white person, almost like Lord of the Flies scenario here, you know? A bunch of white people stranded with only each other to look at. And there is a sad truth to that.
Now, I have to ask, since I've brought up the movie and the film Old Joy together, did you have any, even the most remote inkling that this material could have become a motion picture?
No, quite the contrary. When Kelly, originally started talking about it, I mean, it just seemed incredibly implausible to me. And in fact, even as they were shooting it, I know on the set, there were multiple kind of bets going on among the crew as to whether it could actually be padded out into a feature.
Padded out? Was that the term they used?
Well, I mean, not padded out. That's the wrong term. But whether it could actually become a feature. But I mean, because of the way that Kelly's pacing goes, and just because of her patience, I mean, she was able to bring it to that kind of duration, and then the fact that people actually responded and kind of seemed to recognize these characters and find, to find everything that we had sort of talked about actually visible there is really amazing to me. I mean, it really is. The kind of emotional movements of it are so kind of subtle, and just the techniques are so unintrusive in a certain sense that I just continue to be really amazed that Kelly was able to capture some of the stuff on film and that people were able to read it,
And she found you through your novel, The Half-Life, right?
Yeah, she had read that novel. We had become friends previous to that. We both share a good friend in Todd Haynes, the filmmaker, and so we had met through him, and she read that novel and dug it and was looking for a project, but something that would take fewer resources. I mean, that to adapt that book would have been a lot more of a task than she was able to take on. So she asked if I had any short stories, and this one was there, and she decided to go at it.
And she still wants to do The Half-Life, right? As far as I've heard.
Yeah, she talks about it for sure. At the moment, she's actually gearing up on a screenplay that I wrote that has that's going to take her for a while. But yeah, someday hopefully she can get around to it. I mean, it's kind of a lot more involved project. It's not just like two guys walking around in the woods or like one woman walking the streets looking for her dog. It really would entail a much larger kind of production, and that in some ways is anathema to Kelly. I mean, she really doesn't have that much interest in the huge mechanics of all that stuff and just the politics of it. So, maybe it'll happen. Yeah, I'm not holding my breath.
Now, I want to get your experience across as a writer, because you usually hear them, well, you meaning one usually hears the story of a writer whose work gets adapted, and you hear they sign it away, and then some studio makes it into something completely unrecognizable, and all the writer can do is cash the check and keep their head down.
Exactly.
Essentially, but you were involved. I mean, you were adapting it yourself, right?
Well, I mean, Kelly has done the real lion's share of the adapting, but it has been a really organic process, and I mean, she's been very open and kind of involving, and we're able to kind of continue having a conversation, from the beginning, from the adaptation through the production to a degree. I mean, mostly, she's off in her own world doing the production, but then once the editing begins, she's also very open, and the conversation kind of picks up again. And I mean, I've just been really lucky that someone with Kelly's particular vision has kind of taken on this kind of material. I mean, I also know writers who end up feeling really violated by the adaptations that they see of their work. And I mean, I think I've also been lucky in that she's been adapting short stories, which just kind of don't entail the same cutting and compressing and just general violence that a novel demands as far as to squeeze it into like a 2-hour episode.
It does seem to me that the short story is kind of the, not even just the right thing, but really the only form that can be adapted properly.
That's how I feel, yeah.
And when in the production, I mean, I know you weren't hands-on involved in the production of Old Joy, like you just said, but when did you think to yourself, hey, this could become a product that I won't disown?
Oh, well, I mean, I knew it wasn't going to be that. I mean, I knew Kelly's work, and I knew that it was going to be, you know, at the very least, like a really elegant piece of filmmaking. I guess the point that, and so I was not like necessarily surprised when that happened. I was surprised to see, I mean, it's not like a lot of people saw that film, but it did at least seem to reach critics, and it did, in some ways, just sort of enter a film zeitgeist, at least, you know, like I feel like it had its, like, it was seen by people who would be interested in that kind of thing. And I think, I mean, for me, it was probably seeing it projected at Sundance. We went to Sundance with it that year, and it was just a very low-key kind of screening. I mean, the expectations were very low. We were in a kind of a sidebar program. We weren't in competition or anything, and it was a very friendly crowd of people who had worked on the film and people who knew Kelly and the cast. And watching at that time, you know, I was just, there was kind of just a very gentle effect that it had on, you know, myself and that audience. And I think at that point I was like, oh, this is actually a very, you know, this succeeded. It was a really a beautiful piece of work that Kelly had managed to make. Kelly and everyone else involved in the actual production. And then, yeah, to see it very slowly creep out into the world was, just sort of an ongoing, I mean, it was never like such a gigantic sort of reception, but it was enough that it was like continued to surprise, at least over, you know, the course of the next year.
In the newer film, Wendy and Lucy, the source material known as the story Train Choir in Livability, was that sort of an immediate thing you two entered into, that you would write a story and then adapt that right after Old Joy, or what?
Yeah, we actually started talking about it, I think, maybe even while Old Joy was, I guess Old Joy was already finished, at least. I think it was still kind of having its, I think Kelly was still traveling around with it, though. And, yeah, I mean, I think we had a nice enough collaboration on the one before that Kelly was ready to kind of enter into it again. And in this case, yeah, it kind of stemmed from conversations we were having about just the politics of the day and the aftermath of Katrina and the Bush administration, and also what even at that time was the impending kind of financial problems on the horizon. I mean, I think we were already involved in the real estate bubble to a degree that was clearly unsustainable, and you know, we felt like it could be an interesting moment to make something that was very materially based and that actually dealt with kind of dollars and cents in a way that you rarely see in films, aside from like a bank heist or something. So. And so, you know, with that kind of general sense of theme in mind, and also with Kelly's dog, who also is kind of always going to be part of these productions, we kind of, you know, I went ahead and started writing. I went ahead and wrote a story, basically, that Kelly was my primary kind of reader on, and threw in her kind of 5 cents throughout. Really, that story was it wasn't even entirely finished at the point that I handed it off to her to kind of do the adaptation, and things kind of moved quickly on that project in that way. But yeah, it was, at least in that case, it was something that was initially conceptualized as ultimately a film project. I mean, I wanted to come out of it with a story also, and she liked the fact that it would be written out in prose first and would then be kind of adapted. But it really was always aiming towards the film.
As a fiction writer, though, how does the experience differ when you're writing a story you know is destined for adaptation?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, it's weird. It didn't change that much. I mean, there were certain, you know, I mean, there was sort of Kelly perched on my shoulder, with her own interests and needs that that was different. I mean, that was definitely a different kind of thing. I have to say, for my own process, as it were, films are always kind of playing around in my mind. I mean, I think at this point it's probably hard to write narrative fiction in some ways without, like, the thought of, not with the thought of film as an ultimate product, but just with the thought of film as a kind of source material or as a kind of resource, So, I often find, I guess I think the sort of division between fiction and film can sometimes be overstated. I mean, I think they both rely on each other a lot in this day and age, and there's a kind of symbiosis there that it's always going to play in. I mean, probably soon we'll have video games entering the kind of conversation as well, but yeah, so I think it wasn't radically different. It was somewhat different, but not categorically different.
You're not one to talk about the purity of a medium, then?
No, far from that. The opposite. I'm not into purity. Yeah.
Now, putting these two stories, Wendy and Lucy, well, the story is not Wendy and Lucy, it's Train Choir, the movie is Wendy and Lucy, and then Old Joy, which is also the movie and the story, into this book, Livability. I mean, maybe they're anchor points for the rest of the book, but I wonder, how did the fact that there are two stories that became critically acclaimed movies, how did it affect how this collection was put together, or did it?
Well, I mean, I'd say it affected it in the fact that it got published. I mean, I think I'd be dubious about whether anyone would have even bothered publishing this kind of short story collection if there hadn't at least been the films to kind of coax it into the light. I mean, it's kind of a commercial death knell to do a short story collection in general, and to do one that's just this sort of quiet and like unflashy, I think is doesn't really excite publishers that much. So I think that the fact that it got out into the world is largely due to the films. But then, Old Joy was kind of, I had been hoping that there was, I had been sort of amassing this batch of stories for, they go back probably 10 years, some of them. So they'd been, and Old Joy I had always kind of thought of as being part of a larger batch. To me, they both do work within the larger kind of system of the collection. I mean, I think they both are coming at the themes and the geography from angles that are not really accounted for in the other stories, but that kind of hopefully mesh in some way. So, I feel like they do live comfortably with the other stories. I mean, it's funny, I ended up, they do kind of begin and end the collection, which was a kind of gesture that I was a little bit uncomfortable with. I mean, it kind of maybe highlighted them more than I necessarily wanted to within that batch. But I did kind of like, there was something that they kind of did at the beginning and the end of the collection that I kind of liked. Old Joy opens with the sound of a bell, like there's a meditation bell that kind of opens that story. And I kind of like that being the sort of opening vibration of the collection. And Train Choir ends with the sound of a train whistle as this character is kind of hopping a train and heading north for Alaska. And I just kind of liked that as the sort of bookend of the collection, the bell and the whistle. And so I just had to get over the fact that it might seem sort of pretentious, I guess that's pretentious in its own way too, but like, at least for myself, it had a rationale,
It's always nice to have an explanation, if only for yourself.
If only for yourself, exactly.
An explanation nonetheless. Now, reading all these stories, I have to admit that since I had seen both Old Joy and Wendy and Lucy before reading the book, I was kind of thinking to myself, imagining, what might these stories, all the middle stories, look like? Were they made into a Kelly Reichardt-ish sort of movie?
Yeah, right.
It was hard to resist that. I ultimately couldn't. But do you ever think about maybe writing a story that just could not be filmed no matter what, just because that might be a reader instinct?
Gosh, well, I mean, not really. I mean, it's like the kind of stories that I'm interested in are, I mean, they have a certain traditional kind of character and plot kind of DNA to them. Like, I'm just not that interested in writing highly experimental kind of fiction. And, yeah, I mean, I just think there's always going to be the possibility for, I just think that certain of the kind of just hardwired narrative attitudes that people have they're gonna probably find their way into the stories that I do. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's conceivable to write just a basic, character plot story that could not be filmed. I mean, but yeah, it's not a challenge that I feel the need to set for myself exactly. But nor do I really care whether it's not like these things are written specifically to be adapted. I mean, it's like Kelly is. I find it sort of impossible to conceive of any of these stories being adapted by anyone other than Kelly. I mean, I don't see. I think it would be. Yeah, it's pretty. To me, anyway, they resist. They resist that sort of film impulse in almost every other case.
While reading the stories, I was running across a lot of characters like, for example, Old Joy's Kurt, who was this more dissolute half of the pair of friends that go into the forest. Characters like Benny, the tweaker, who nobody can find. Characters like Alyssa, the artistic, sort of a free spirit who can't quite hold together a steady life. Is it a question that really is interesting to you of what the border is, or where the borderline is located between the free spirit and kind of someone who's drifting through life? Yeah, I think so. I mean, I have let's see, what is that? I mean, I think there is, I'm interested in people's conceptions of freedom and lifestyle, I guess. I mean, I'm kind of interested in the lifestyle that some of these people are pursuing. And I guess I'm then interested in the kind of limitations of that lifestyle. Even I'm curious to see where kind of that dream of freedom does sort of peter out into something much more just quotidian. At which point the more liberated kind of person finds themselves in kind of ruts even of their own liberation, if that makes any sense. You mean like liberation comes around the other side and becomes a stricture again?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's kind of maybe what I'm interested in with those characters in particular. Yeah.
It's like Verna or Wendy, depending on what you want to call her, in Train Choir / Wendy and Lucy, that, I mean, in a way, she's free in that she doesn't have anything, but she's also one of the least free people I've seen in film in recent memory.
Yeah.
She doesn't. Yeah. She's motivated by the desire to eventually junk her car and to find her dog, or right. Not. And I wonder, with this character, this Verna / Wendy, I'll call her Verna. Why not? Since we're talking about the book, was it a consideration for you to avoid making this a story avoid making it the Book of Job, essentially, where just a lot of bad stuff piles onto a person? Because it doesn't read like that. But when I recount the events, a lot of bad stuff piles onto her. So
yeah, it does.
What happens there?
Yeah, I'll say, there are a couple things there. Like, for one, I think, her kind of story, I think, is motivated really almost entirely out of just material constraints on her life. Like, I never thought of her as being particularly ideological or kind of I never thought of her in the same way as like a Kurt or something like that, where she's driven by an idea of some kind. I mean, I think she's really driven by circumstances and by just material reality. And then, within that, it does become kind of a punishing, few days that she has to live through. And which is probably part of a much larger punishing arc. And it's funny. I really did struggle to try and find a way to end her story on a note of more kind of promise or more, I really wanted her to somehow get through it and kind of decide to do something or just find a way of solving her problems in some kind of way, even if it was in a kind of limited way. But I really tried many different ways of at least of ending that story that would keep her in a more upbeat kind of place, and it just never really seemed to work. I just really felt like the kind of way that story goes is sort of dictated by the story itself, and I just it really does come out to seem like a bummer, and I hope that it's the kind of bummer that makes people feel like their own experiences are being kind of validated in some way, or that brings some consolation to people rather than merely kind of depressing them. But there's just no way around it at a certain point.
For those just tuning in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. If you'd like to hear any other Marketplace of Ideas interview, including this one again, check out our complete archive at colinmarshallradio.com. My guest is Jon Raymond, author of the new short story collection Livability, as well as co-screenwriter of the films Old Joy and Wendy and Lucy. But it's fascinating because I read coverage of the film Wendy and Lucy, and people will talk about it, positive reviews, and they'll actually say that they found that ending, which was essentially the same ending as the story.
Yeah.
They said they found it hopeful.
I know. I find that incredible. I also find it hilarious. They say the same thing about Old Joy too, that there's some hopeful sort of ending to it. And God bless them for finding some hope in all these things. And I hope that is the case. I don't want to dictate people's feelings, but both of them have always seemed to me to be fairly grim.
It's something that I notice in these stories, reading them, that often, maybe you buy this or maybe you don't. There's characters that the characters tend to be adrift. They don't know what to do. And is it an impulse to make them less adrift as the story ends, like you've just said, or is that kind of not on your mind when you're writing these characters, the moments of these characters' lives?
Let's see. I do want certainly to. Yeah, I'm not. I think I would like endings. I guess I like endings that come to some sort of conclusion or to some sort of clarity in some way. I hope that they're, even if they are left adrift, I hope there's at least some kind of a more precise way in which they are adrift by the end than perhaps they began with. Maybe I don't entirely know. Maybe I'm not entirely understanding the idea of the characters being adrift. Yeah,
that's a really vague word, so I do want to clarify a bit, because adrift, I don't know. Yeah, I'm going to toss that word for a second. I'll jump that, and I'll say what I mean is that maybe confusion gets it better. You have a Kurt from Old Joy who doesn't know what to do. Wendy Wendy/Verna for a different set of reasons doesn't know what to do.
Yeah. Okay, I think I'm seeing what you're saying. I think certainly very few of these characters are driven by none of them seem to have enormous goals or they're not driven by, or they're just not that driven, I guess, in some kind of ways by success or fear. I don't know exactly what people are driven by, and I guess maybe that's where it all stems from. It's I don't really understand what would drive people to want to do a lot of things in general. So
and you're a guy who writes
that sensibility into characters.
But you're a guy who writes, and you're a guy who's had his work made into films. You would seem to be, from the outside, a fairly driven guy yourself.
Well, but it's not for the normal things, I guess. I think it's there. Yeah, I can't deny that I am driven to do certain things and to finish things, at least. A lot of that just stems from an evasion as well. It's just kind of that I don't want to do certain other things. So this ends up being my way of avoiding certain other possibilities. I'm a believer in the kind of negative path of decision making. So
it's funny. I was thinking back, just hearing this, to an element that may be one of the things that connects you to Kelly Reichardt. As I was reading an interview with her about Wendy and Lucy, and the interviewer asks, "Well, you're getting more successful. As you get this success, how do you think you're going to change? And she kind of went off.
Yeah, I read that one too. That was a really good one.
It's the issue of defining success. I mean, you both seem to have this sensibility that success isn't really success isn't a thing, a state that you reach. Is that correct?
I would say, yeah. I mean, everything in history and literature seems to point to the fact that, like, a person is never exactly, never really gets to feel that sense of self-satisfaction, I guess. I would be inclined to say success doesn't really exist at all, but the illusion of success certainly exists, and drives people to do various things. I just don't understand. For me, it's hard to understand why people want to invest their energy in doing certain, just certain things that would lead, I guess, to their success. I don't understand why people would want to make the vast majority of movies that get made. I mean, it just looks like such an incredible amount of work, and unless it was something that you really, cared about and seemed like it was bringing something interesting into the world, I just don't understand the point,
Yes, it's true. There is that element, but then I'm thinking of the story New Shoes from Livability, where you have the writer-director who, he's got a family to feed, so that's part of it. I mean, something's driving him to pitch this. He's
driven, yeah, right. And I think it's like, in that case, I guess he is driven in a way that I can kind of relate to. I mean, he wants to, he's ultimately, he's his project is maybe somewhat silly. I mean, he's trying to get the green light on a movie about, basically a kind of Animal House meets Mr. Smith Goes to Washington movie, I guess, which actually is a movie I would like to see. I would like to see that movie. But I think to me the drive that he has is, it is basically about being an artist, and it is, that's about as close to a kind of ambition as I'm able to sort of comprehend, and it's all sort of defined in the story in his own terms, I guess, but those at least are terms that I can kind of understand. And I do think disappointment and failure is a very real emotion out there too. I certainly can relate to those things. I guess I can't deny that I have a drive to do certain things and to see certain things happen, and I think. I think that's a good character to kind of, at least for me, that character probably comes closest to sort of naming what those things are. I feel like I lost the thread there a little bit, but.
And I have to ask. I heard this somewhere. Were you actually involved with such a script, an Animal House meets Mr. Smith Goes to Washington?
Well, yeah, I did actually. Me and some friends we decided to. See, well, this is exactly what I'm talking about. We decided it was an idea that we thought would be interesting, but we didn't want to, expend an enormous amount of energy on it either, because we knew it was probably not going to happen. So we got together and spent about 3 days writing it. And really that was the sort of pleasure of it, was just hanging out with these friends of mine and, cranking out this kind of goofy comedy script in 3 days. And then, sure enough, nothing did happen with it, But we were all pretty strict about not investing a huge amount of our time in something that we only kind of really wanted to see happen.
It's a recipe for success.
Yeah, or something, or at least of avoiding total frustration and pain. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm again reminded of some various interviews with Kelly I read where she bemoans, maybe indirectly, the fact that Hollywood seems to be to her full of people desperately pushing things that they know aren't that good.
Yeah, right, exactly, totally.
I take it you're happy you haven't had to go through the same press through the same press ringers as she has for Wendy and Lucy.
No. Yeah, I'm happy not to do that. Although I get to hear about it from her plenty, but no. There's just a kind of promotion that happens on movies that is just quantumly different than books. Yeah, and even within the movies, I feel like I got to do the perfect amount of press for the movie. I got to go to a few film festivals. I got to talk to a few people and at least say my piece. But it never becomes that dog and pony show that she has to go through, where she just is saying the exact same thing over and over again to every single blogger that exists. It's doesn't sound very fun. It just, yeah. And it's it's not really work. It's not doing real work at a certain point. It's like most of the stuff she ends up saying has been said somewhere else, and if someone really cared, they could go find it. So I can understand her frustration.
Hence my policy of not interviewing anybody during an official press junket, because I don't want to have my head bitten off.
Right. Well, and if you're interviewing people involved with books anyway, there's never really going to be that problem of overexposure unless you're unless you're one of about 8 people.
That's true. Now, when you saw the final product, Wendy and Lucy, that had been made from your story, Train Choir, I kind of want to know how different an entity do you consider it to be? Is this a cinematic translation of your story, essentially, or had they become different things? Had they evolved away from each other at a point?
Let's see. Gosh, that's a good question.
Maybe compared to Old Joy and how that happened there.
Yeah. Well, I think that with Old Joy there was just always this sort of surprise that it existed whatsoever. It was just such a. That story had a very charmed life. I wrote it actually as a kind of assignment also in response to the photographs of this really great photographer, Justine Kurland, and it was published in a book with her photographs. And so that alone seemed like a fairly amazing endpoint for a short story. And that then it went on and became that film. It had its own very strange arc. With this one, because it was kind of all leaning on each other throughout. I wouldn't say it's like a direct translation whatsoever. When I see the film, I am always kind of just impressed and surprised by the choices that Kelly and the actors make. Just the idea of camera placement alone. That was such a kind of a lovely surprise to find when I was finally seeing the footage that they had done. I kind of see the scenes in my own kind of way, but then to have Kelly bring that kind of the kind of photographic eye that she has. I just think she has an amazing knack for compositions. And to me, watching the film ends up largely being like almost kind of a photo book, where I just get to watch really pretty photos go by. I almost tune out the words and the storyline just because they're kind of familiar enough to me at this point. There are really genuine additions that happen in the translation into film, and and I guess I assume there are losses too. There are certainly sentences that I'm attached to in the story that will never be known by people who just watch the film. They are. It's weird. I guess to me there's a kind of doubleness. There's a way in which the film does hew so closely to the storyline, and actually, and in both cases, I feel like both films they really are faithful to the movements of the stories. But then there are just new things that kind of emerge in the cinema experience that I never would have kind of imagined in the story, or that are just not possible to do in a story.
Although you're no stranger to cinematic production yourself, right? You had a public access cable TV movie back.
Oh my God! Wow, you've done some digging there. Yeah,
I had to hear about this. I had to hear about it.
That's funny. Actually, it's ironic. Back in actually about 13 years ago now, I and some friends made a movie through the Portland Cable Access auspices. Based on the comic strip Croc, which likely you don't remember. It's by the same guy that did BC and Wizard of Id.
Oh yes.
And this was sort of his third comic strip. It was more kind of a French Foreign Legion kind of thing. And so it was like an incredibly amateur production. It's really through that, I got no sense of actually making a movie. I knew nothing about making a movie, and I came out of it not knowing anything about making a movie, although somehow in between, a feature-length video had been assembled. But the interesting thing about it is we're actually, I think in the fall, we're going to do a kind of 13-year anniversary screening of it for those people who are involved. So that's actually going to be kind of fun. Yeah.
Wow. Now, back to the movie that got a wider release than that, Wendy and Lucy.
Yeah, the Croc showed one time before we got a cease and desist order on it, actually. So.
You literally got a cease and desist order on it?
Well, we got a letter from the lawyers of the guy. It was reviewed in the newspaper up here, and I guess someone noticed that it had. I mean, the irony is no one else really wanted to see the movie. It's not like we really were going to screen it again, but we got a letter from the lawyers saying that we could never do that. So,
Johnny Hart's lawyers go right to your door. Oh my!
Yeah.
Now, with the new film, or with I suppose the story or the film, when you talked about how you had it informed, shaped by the economic circumstances of the time and to the current time. What are the pitfalls there? I mean, I imagine the danger is to make some kind of didactic thing that's like, this is how society is wrong. I mean, how is that avoided?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Well, yeah, I mean, to me, I guess to me it was avoided by, grounding it. There's a lot of talk about the movie being somehow about the economic situation, and to some degree that's true, but it's also, to me, like about the relationship between Wendy and Lucy and the kind of intense rapport that they have. And, I mean, it's in some ways a kind of a love story between, a girl and her dog. And to me, that was always sort of the real heart of it. I mean, it's about that kind of the kind of responsibilities that Wendy feels towards this creature, and the kind of needs that she extracts from the dog too. And I think as long as that was really at center stage, like the kind of economics can all go on and inform what happens, but they hopefully will never overwhelm it. I mean, I feel like the progression of the story is really about that relationship more so than about the finances.
So would you say, contrary to reviewers, for example, who would say there's a political point being made, there's more of a rootedness in national circumstances than anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll try to, have my cake and eat it, too. I mean, there are political points to be made, certainly, and, I mean, it did, gestate out of a certain kind of political disgust, I guess. But hopefully, but I don't like watching movies that are too, finger pointing in that kind of way either. I mean, I would really hope that kind of, that the political impulses are really subsidiary to the emotional ones in it. So, I think the political reading is totally available, and in many ways it's an easier one to kind of write about, But I think what makes the story interesting is these two characters and their relationship.
There was a quote that I read from you once that I found quite fascinating about picking up a tradition of regional modernist writing that also cares who the president is. And reading Livability, I believe that George Bush was only mentioned once. So what does it mean for a story to care who the president is that does not involve a mention of the president?
What I'm trying to say there is just, I feel like at some point there was a kind of, some sort of division, or there's some sort of bifurcation of literary ambitions or something. This is a really grandiose theory, by the way, and it's totally unsupportable and probably specious. But I think that you look at writers like Sherwood Anderson or Sinclair Lewis or people writing more in the first part of the century who are very much grounded in their regions, but also were very much interested in kind of broader socio-historical and economic movements going on. I mean, in many ways, they're writing about the invention of modernity in Ohio or in Kansas or wherever, the sort of arrival of new immigrants and the creation of new factories and the kind of the ways in which these places were knitted into larger national discourses. I mean, I feel like by the time you get to Raymond Carver or that kind of generation of what I guess the closest thing to like regionalist writing. The kind of psychology has become really closed off in a certain way, and I feel like you're dealing with people who are really, really cut off from communities or from just from the daily like news. You know, I mean, it's like I think there's a kind of hermeticism to some of that generation's writing about provincial life that I feel like is a loss. You know, I'm kind of interested in, you know, like I don't know why, you know, Don DeLillo and Pynchon and people like that are the ones who get to write about, you know, big political kind of things, and people like Raymond Carver and, you know, Richard Ford or something are left with just people drinking beer in like a bar somewhere, you know? Like, I just think there's a way that those two things can kind of happen at the same time.
There's been like a closing then of fiction's purview into the head of the characters rather than their wider context.
Yeah, I think so. And that like part of the premise of it is that they are, I mean, there's almost a pride in like not having them relate to like any kind of larger community. I mean, I remember a review, I think, that Colson Whitehead wrote of a Richard Ford collection where he's like, where are these guys' friends? You know, like, where are the, you know, why does this guy he's writing about the character in the Richard Ford book, and it's like, why does this guy not seem to have anyone that he can sort of talk to in any way? And I mean, I guess the same thing could be said of Livability, but I never exactly thought of it that way. I mean, I hope that these people seem to exist in a world where they talk about real estate a lot, and they talk about at least occasionally George Bush, and they talk about, you know, shared civic life in some way, even if it's not something that they're exactly a part of or, you know, directly invested in.
It seems like it might be, tell me how true you think this is, a useful tool to, I mean, even if you just want to get onto the page, as best you can, a sketch of what's inside a character's head. Their wider circumstances are a good way to do that. For example, the kid Brian in the story Young Bodies, who a lot of his idealism comes across with him talking about George Bush. Is that a tool that has wider application than that, or is that kind of unique to that sort of character?
Well, I feel like that had something specific to do with that character and the relationship with that girl. Like, I mean, I think there was a kind of tiredness of his, like complaining that that said something about him and about the circumstances they are in. But yeah, I mean, I would hope that I would think that almost any of the characters in that batch could at some point start waxing about the Bush administration, because most of those were written during the Bush administration. But like, I would like to think that, like, yeah, their political perspectives could be tapped in some way. I mean, I certainly could see that happening. I mean, just going through in my mind, I can certainly see that happening in numerous of the stories, you know.
We're getting toward the tail end of the program, so I want to make sure to ask you, considering you are a self-admitted jingoistic booster of Portland, I want to ask, when somebody asks you why they might consider going out to Portland, what's your best pitch for the city?
God, you know, I'd say right now it's the food. There's like genuinely a kind of an amazing food thing happening here. We are lucky to live in the Willamette Valley, and we're very close to a lot of farming, and so there's not a lot of, like, there's a lot of really fresh produce. And interestingly, like, a kind of an amazing meat culture has happened here. Like, a lot of the restaurants are going pretty far with the, like, tip to tail, like, organically raised, like, meat dishes. And like, this is something the New York Times has really been pushing hard, but it's really true. Like, there's kind of like the geography of restaurants in this town has just like exploded in the last few years, and if you're into eating, it's kind of a good place to be.
Yeah, I noticed that when I was down there, when I was in 07, I was like, I got to eat everything in this town. I got to go back to Portland and get me some food. Anyway,
yeah.
The book, once again, is Livability, and the films are Old Joy and Wendy and Lucy. Jon Raymond, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the program.
Thank you so much. It was really fun.
This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. As always, our music is produced by Ben Althouse. See his website at benalthouse.com. If you'd like to hear this interview again or any other interview that's ever been on the show, visit colinmarshallradio.com for the complete Marketplace of Ideas interview archive. That is colinmarshallradio.com. KCSB-FM.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.